Welcome to The Shift, a weekly live stream series from the Story of Stuff project. I'm Michael O'Heaney, the project's executive director, and today I'll be talking with Maureen Taylor and Alissa Weinman about the growing battle over who has access to clean water during and after the pandemic. But first, a word about The Shift. The coronavirus pandemic is forcing all of us to answer some tough questions about our societies, from how well we share resources to how resilient our communities really are. But could this crisis actually be an opportunity to spark investment in an economy that works better for people and the planet? What if we could come out of the other side of this more resilient than before? We started The Shift to talk with the thinkers and doers shaping how we're seeing and reacting to the pandemic and what comes after. So let's get to it. Imagine life without a reliable water supply in your home. While most of us take access to clean, affordable water for granted, there's a growing battle in this country over who gets it, with poor people, and in particular poor people of color, losing access to running water because they can't afford their utility bill. Now, with unemployment soaring in the United States, advocates have won a wave of emergency orders barring utilities from shutting off the water of residents who can't pay their bill. But 2/5 of Americans remain at risk of a shutoff, despite what we all know, that frequent hand washing is critical to preventing the spread of the disease. Today, I'm joined by two leaders in this fight. Maureen Taylor joins us from Detroit, Michigan. Maureen has served as the chair of the Michigan Welfare Rights Organization since 1993 and is a longtime leader in the fight for water access and justice. We're also joined by Corporate Accountability's Alissa Weinman, who leads that organization's campaign challenging corporate control of water. Thank you both so much for joining us. I'm so glad you're here. Maureen, I wanted to start with you. Your home city of Detroit has been at the epicenter of the fight over water access. Tens of thousands of Detroit households have had their water disconnected since 2014 as part of a widely condemned debt collection program. And in the last year alone, taps were turned off in more than 23,000 homes, 3/5 of which were still without water when the pandemic struck. But before we get into the sort of current governor's order, the decision to suspend these water shutoffs, can I just ask you to sort of paint a picture of the battle that has been raging in your city over the last decade, really, in terms of access to water?
Okay, well, thank you very much for including welfare rights in our conversation into this live broadcast. I'm very highly impressed with the technical skills of the folks involved here, so kudos to that. In January, February of 2014, the struggle that we're engaged in today had its sprouts, had its beginnings right about then. And that's when the water department suggested that if you're $150 behind or 2 months behind in a water payment, that you were subject to have your water turned off. And the first list that I received, and again, we're talking February, right around February, maybe March of 2014, that first list had 59,990 addresses on it. I thought it was a typo because it's not possible for this kind of a concept to be put forward. But I was wrong. And the water department began to aggressively and without any kind of thinking, no humanity involved, they started to cut water off. And of course, you know, we were involved with fight backs, pushbacks. We launched a legal campaign. We contacted the United Nations. We reached the Pope. We were talking to everybody about who was in position to help this issue go away. And we were semi-successful in certain areas. But we've been in a toe-to-toe pitch battle with the city of Detroit since then. And what changed, you know, they could not hear the cries of the poor and the low income and the elderly and the veterans. The disabled people couldn't hear it. But for whatever reason, COVID-19 has a large voice. And the city of Detroit heard that voice only after the Governor Gretchen Whitmer, said turn all the water on, and that's after we started to loudly complain. You cannot tell people that the first line of defense in fighting the virus is to wash your hands when thousands of people don't have water. You can't put both of those concepts into the same sentence. So she started one of the first executive orders demanding that all the water be turned on, and that's how we got to this point where we are today.
Can you give me, Maureen, just kind of, I want to talk about the moratorium and the effort to to turn the taps back on, but give me a sense, what was the Detroit Water Authority thinking? I mean, these shutoffs, what was the goal? Was this the sort of
Um,
forced payment, or?
the goal was to intimidate and to what would be the right word, to bind low income people to a position that says, in an effort to keep your water on, you will do anything and say anything. You make any kind of promise, you have to. And knowing that a large percentage of people in the city of Detroit, and we're talking about 2014 and even more today, a large percentage of people were living on fixed income. And those that were working were making less than or right around than minimum wage. So the point was, and I remember this one news reporter that made this statement, that there are people in Detroit that would rather pay their cable bill rather than their water bill. And that was always a lie. I've met thousands, hundreds of thousands of people in this campaign, and I have not met one person that says, I prefer to live in my house or my apartment without water. No such entity exists. So the point was always to punish you because you're poor. And that's what this was about. You get punished even worse if you're poor and a person of color. And all three of the hammers come on your head. If you are poor, if you are a person of color, and you have children. Because, the only detriment in America is that welfare recipient. And that's the reason why the whole country was going to hell in the bucket. So the point was pressure people, push them to the point, make them pay that water bill. And if they don't, when they come back to try to get the water restored, you not only have to pay your current bill, but whatever the penalty is because you're low income. James Brown said it best. Welcome to America.
And, so Maureen, here we are in the midst of this pandemic that has hit Michigan and Detroit particularly hard. I know, my thoughts, and I think the thoughts of a lot of our viewers are with you and the people in your state. But, as you mentioned, the governor has ordered this moratorium and basically said you've got to turn the water back on to these households that didn't have water. What are you actually seeing there on the ground? Is that happening? Are people having their water turned back on?
The initial efforts of the city, and very reluctant to put that executive order into place, they swung into action after several false starts. And they engaged an organization called Wayne Metro. And Welfare Rights has worked with Wayne Metro, and generally they're a good group of people. But they engaged Wayne Metro to be the repository of the telephone calls of people who are calling to make arrangements to get their water turned back on. Now, so far, the city reports that they've reconnected somewhere just under 2,000 households. Our fear is, and what our pain is that the city also says they sent people to knock on doors where they were understanding people were living and the water was off. And then they would say, well, we knocked on the door. There was a toy on the front porch, but nobody came to the door. So we're afraid that a lot of people who have water on, are whose water's already turned off, I mean to say, is that they're worried and apprehensive if a person with a sign that says City of Detroit comes to the house. So we're launching efforts to try to send out a communication, a communique, if you will, to people across Detroit based on this information about you have to be able to wash your hands and surfaces in your household. to try to see if you are without water, you can get your water turned on now. So of course we're suspicious of a group of people that say, I'm going to do the best I can, and then wink, wink.
Yeah.
So that's where we are right now, apprehensive, and we're looking. If we have to go door to door at the end of this, we're gonna find everybody who does not have water, even if your pipes are broken. So that's where we are now.
Thank you so much for your work. Alissa, I want to bring you into the conversation. Detroit may be an epicenter in the water wars, but it's not alone. And while you and your fellow advocates have made really great strides in gaining shutoff moratoriums around the country, as I mentioned in the intro, it is not nationwide. There are still a large portion of Americans who are at risk of a shutoff. There's a lot more work to be done. Can you give us sort of a sense of the status of that campaign around the country?
Absolutely. Yeah, and thanks for having me, Michael and Maureen. It's always great to hear you share your story out of Detroit. So, corporate accountability has been working really closely with the wide swath of national and local groups trying to advance stronger national protections for utility shutoffs writ large. And in terms of water, we know that water is a fundamental human right and shouldn't be treated as a commodity during a pandemic, before a pandemic, or after a pandemic. And due to this growing movement for stopping the inhumane practice of water shutoffs, at this moment, over 600 municipalities in the US have implemented a moratorium on this practice during the pandemic. And right now, that's protecting over 190 million people, or roughly 60% of the US population, from one of the most extreme forms of water injustice. And this is amazing, but we need more, which is why we are advocating for national legislation to deal with this patchwork that's existing with municipalities across the country, and also ensuring that we are reconnecting people's service who had their service disconnected prior to the crisis, as well as dealing with late fees and reconnection fees that are only going to hurt people once we come out of both the pandemic and the economic downturn.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, sooner or later this epidemic will be over, but what happens then? When we worked on the story of water, which we're going to stream after this program together last year, we talked about ways that municipal utilities were trying to make it easier for residents to pay, including a concept called tiered assistance programs. Can you kind of help us understand how that might be useful once the pandemic is over, once people are sort of going back to normal life, once they have this water, that maybe they have difficulty with their bill? How can utilities actually move away from this sort of punitive, we're going to shut people's water off, to something that actually that's something that works?
Absolutely. So at the root of a lot of these issues that our city's water systems are facing is the need for increased federal investment. So that's a whole other issue we need to deal with. But cities are doing a lot of great work implementing water affordability programs, like you mentioned, because they make sense, they're more equitable, and they enable the city to actually spend time and resources investing in their water systems. So Philly is a great example of this. Due to unaffordable water rates in the cities, residents became concerned about having their water shut off or losing their homes due to unpaid water bills. And this was not only impacting people, but also impacting the well-being of the utility, because they were not connecting any revenue from tens of thousands of people who couldn't afford these unaffordable bills. So that's why the city took steps to establish an income-based tiered assistance program, or a TAP program. And it bases or groups ratepayers based on their income level. And it also forgives past penalties for late or non-payment if residents pay their bills full and on time for 24 months. So it basically enables the system to recoup the money that it needs to run, while also ensuring that people can afford their water rates, instead of intimidating people, like Maureen said, turning off their access. And Detroit also did a lot of great work on affordability.
Maureen, one of the sort of more startling pieces of news to come out in the last couple of weeks was the fact that Coke and Pepsi, two of the biggest corporations in the world, were actually two of the largest debtors to the Detroit public water system. So you have a situation where a resident could have their water shut off for being as little as $150 in arrears, as you mentioned, and yet these massive companies, which bottle municipal water from Detroit to create their big bottling brands, Aquafina, Dasani, they were themselves in arrears. They owed tens of thousands of dollars to the Detroit public water system. Does that double standard surprise you?
Not at all, and this is not news. One of the very first things we recognized and was revealed to us when this newest wave of fight back and pushback started against these water shutoffs is that we were finding out that there were structures like Comerica Park where the tigers live and where the lions play, and some of these golf courses, these places that were owned and operated by rich people. I mean, and it's astounding. And here comes Coke and Pepsi. They're the newest. I was going to say a bad word. The newest stepchildren in this activity, and they have arrearages that are shocked. And of course, it's the same response. We tell the water department, how is it that you're letting these people get away with $100,000, $200,000, $300,000 in arrears? And whatnot, and they always say the same thing. Well, Maureen, Pepsi and Coke are disputing the bill. Well, Mrs. Johnson, that had a bill of $151, she was disputing hers as well. So no, this is not news. This is the kind of thing that happens. You get a $1,200 stimulus check, but American Airlines, United Airlines, and some of those folks got millions of dollars. They cried and said, oh my goodness, we're in trouble. Here comes the check. And they got big money, but you're still waiting on your $1,200. And that's the same way that governments seem to treat folks. What regular, low income, moderate income people need, that's a strain on them. So there's that class battle. Rich people get what they want. The yachts are able to continue, but those of us in the rowboats are struggling.
No question about it. Alissa, I think this speaks to this issue. One of the things that's happened over the last couple of months is as the pandemic has kind of gripped the country, is that there's been this rush to buy bottled water, which is, of course, despite the fact that there's no evidence that coronavirus is transmitted through the public water system. But that sort of rush says as much about the kind of state of our public water infrastructure and the kind of confidence of the public in that water infrastructure, which I think probably most of our viewers will know, and certainly the two of you know, the federal government has basically all but abandoned in recent decades. I guess there's some discussion now around stimulus funds, kind of reinvestment in infrastructure at the federal level. Are you hopeful that there's the possibility, at least, of an opportunity here to win sort of renewed federal investment in public water infrastructure?
Yeah, great question. And I am hopeful. But I think to understand the moment that we're in right now, it's important to take a look back. And the U.S. in the past has been heralded for having some of the strongest water systems in the world. And one of the main reasons is that we had a major prioritization of public water because in the late 1800s, early 1900s, wealthier people were able to acquire clean water, like Maureen was mentioning, because they had the funds to purchase it, while poor communities were at risk for major health outbreaks like cholera. And that's why we as a society overhauled our water and drinking water infrastructure and brought this issue to the public sector, making safe, clean water accessible to all. And then we flash forward to today, and many of these strong systems have eroded due to this decline that you mentioned in federal investment, but also because private water corporations like Veolia, like Suez, like bottlers like Nestle have positioned themselves as this false solution to fill the gap. And this is forcing our cities to pick up the tab and making hard decisions between what essential services to invest in. So that's why we are really thankful to Representative Lawrence out of Detroit, who has actually spearheaded a great federal vehicle called the Water Act, which would overhaul our nation's water systems through direct federal investment while providing millions of jobs and advancing water justice. And it's gaining ground. It has about 84 co-sponsors right now, and we're really hopeful about it.
Now certainly it'd be the moment to push as companies, including the kinds of companies that we've been talking about on this chat, have their hands out. Now is the time for citizens, for people around the country to push for the kinds of investments in the common good that, like you said, we've made historically. So there's the Federal Water Act, and I guess, Maureen, I would just ask you at the sort of state or local level, are you looking for more action from your elected officials as well? You know, what can happen at that level?
Most certainly, at the state level, we've got some outstanding representative, Stephanie Chang, Sherry. There's a list of folks that we have been working with over these few years, and they're moving closer and closer to introducing legislation that makes shutoffs illegal, make a water affordability plan based on income, the law of at least the Michigan land. So yes, there are efforts that are going forward, but this is like pushing a boulder uphill, because for whatever reason, people are not concerned about whether or not all people are able to have access to water. So yes, there are legislative activities going on, and you know, in this fight, we've got different levels of involvement. We've got a legal team, we've got a medical team, we've got a street team, a youth team. We have all of that, and the head of our legal work, Attorney Alice Jennings, has introduced at least once, it might be twice already, a national conversation to try to get a congressional piece around affordability to make water shutoffs illegal and to impose a water affordability program that's nationwide. So we're walking on a national footing, and we're walking on state and local footing at the same time.
Well, it may be a boulder to push up a hill, but I am for sure glad that you, Maureen, and Alissa both have your shoulders against that boulder and have been pushing. Before we go, I want to just kind of give you each an opportunity to talk to the audience, to basically ask for what you think viewers should be doing to support your organizations, to be pushing this fight forward, to be pushing that boulder up the hill. Maybe Alissa, we'll start with you.
Sure. I think there's a lot we can be doing on the federal level right now to get behind the boulder. The first thing folks can do is reach out to both their representatives and senators, asking them to support a moratorium on all utility shutoffs in the next COVID-19 relief package. And in addition to that, we should be asking our elected officials to also support the Water Act for the fact that it will increase investment in our infrastructure, again, provide jobs for people at a critical time, and restrict access to these funds from private corporations.
Right.
And also contribute to the great work that Michigan Welfare Rights Organization is doing in Detroit.
Thanks so much, Alissa. Maureen?
I say, Alissa, you're just so sweet all the time. Ordinarily, I would give a long description here, but let me just share the number to welfare rights, and people can call us 313-964-2500, 313-964-2500, and call us, because always if you have $5 or $10 laying around, perhaps you might send it in. But I want to end by saying, ordinarily I call to say support activities going on with welfare rights. We're part of a bigger group called the People's Water Board. You can reach them through the same number. But I want to say this. Right now, there are a number of picketers and demonstrators outside of meat packing industries where folks are being told, mostly immigrants, practically all women, you have to go inside these meat packaging and producing facilities without the gowns, without the gloves, without the mask. You have to risk your life. And we have a governor in Idaho and a governor in Texas that have indicated if you refuse to work because you're afraid, we're going to make certain that you are fired, which means you are not eligible for unemployment benefits. I can't believe the horror that people are going through at these meat packing activities. So as much as welfare rights and the People's Water Board, corporate accountability need help, those sisters and brothers with the commercial food handling unions need help more. Send them $7 a piece so they can keep this fight up. And God bless them.
Amen to that. Thank you so much, Maureen. And, I'm reminded just in closing, it's May 1st, it's International Workers' Day. So an incredibly important message you just shared there. There are also workers from Walmart, Amazon, and a series of other employers who are walking off the job to protest conditions today. One of our early episodes of The Shift, we talked with a Walmart worker about the conditions that they're experiencing. And I'd certainly encourage viewers today to support workers around the country who are organizing for their rights. Thank you both. Thank you. Thank you both so much for joining us on The Shift. I really appreciate it. Thank you to the viewers for joining us as well. If you enjoyed this live stream, please like it, add a comment below, and share it with your friends and family. You can always find great content like this on storyofstuff.org, and you can find ways to support our programming there as well. And now we'll be played out with The Story of Water, our 2019 animated short that explores many of the issues we discussed today. Until next time, I'm Michael O'Heaney. Thank you for joining The Shift.
My name is Bernard C. Jack Young, Mayor of the great city of Baltimore. Imagine life without a reliable water supply, sewage, or wastewater treatment. You'll probably agree that access to clean, safe water is a human right, right? So why don't our elected officials seem to prioritize it? The federal government is investing way less in water services than ever before, thanks in part to the efforts of the private water industry. But water is a public good that relies on public funds. So, many cities across the U.S. are facing significant water woes. Short on dollars and stuck with aging infrastructure, these cities have become vulnerable to corporations that swoop in with promises of new pipes and better services for their residents. All these cities have to do is turn over control of their public water system to a corporation that will run them with little oversight. What could go wrong? A lot, as it turns out. Corporations offer a variety of privatization schemes, promising they'll save city money. But when water is privatized, water bills are often much higher than local government-owned utility rates. Corporations say they'll invest in our system and their service will improve. But cost-cutting to maximize their profit makes that impossible. Many systems experience frequent main breaks, service disruption, and even the drastic downsizing of workforces, meaning fewer jobs and people to keep things running safely. And those with the least ability to pay, they're hit hardest by water privatization. Higher income communities tend to have better access to services because they can afford rising rates, which only heightens inequality. And what happens if a city wants to break free from a deal gone awry? They often have to buy back their own infrastructure or pay millions of dollars in termination fees. But it doesn't have to be this way. Cities across the country are finding innovative new ways to publicly manage their water system. So people come first, not profits. Like Philadelphia, where 40% of households were unable to pay their increasing bills. They implemented something called a tiered assistance program, where residents pay a price that's relative to their incomes. Now residents can afford essential water services, and their infrastructure gets a much-needed investment without turning to profit-driven corporations. South Bend, Indiana also avoided privatization, despite needing millions in system improvements. They integrated smart sewers that identify leakage areas and better manage the system, saving them $400 million, enough to keep public control. And my city, Baltimore, became the first U.S. city to ban certain forms of privatization, making a long-term commitment to public water. Let's spread the word about the hundreds of successful public water solutions being tested around the country. We know what really happens when a city turns over this precious resource to corporations. Let your local officials know that you support public water solutions and urge your Congress members to reinvest in our water systems nationwide. Let's send a message that water is a public good and should not be privately controlled. Keep our water system in public hands.